On the night of October 30th, 1784, the servants of Blackwood Manor were ordered to plug their ears with beeswax. They were told to ignore the screaming coming from the east wing. Lady Audrey Vance, the most sought-after heiress in Northumberland, had vanished hours before her wedding. History books will tell you she fell ill. The local gossips claimed she ran away. But the private journals of the Vance family, unsealed only recently, reveal a much darker truth. She wasn't missing. She was walled up in the widow's tower, left to break or freeze before dawn. But her captors made one fatal miscalculation. They forgot that the Duke of Ashbourne owned a fast horse, a loaded pistol, and a promise that even death couldn't sever. This is the true story of the Midnight Duke. Northumberland, England. October 29th, 1784. The archive records of the Vance family describe the winter of 1784 as one of the cruelest in a decade. Frost had hardened the ground of the moors into iron, and the fog that rolled off the North Sea was thick enough to choke a man. But inside Blackwood Manor, the atmosphere was even more suffocating. Lady Audrey Vance stood on a pedestal in the centre of her dressing room, her arms raised like a doll, while 3 seamstresses pinned layers of heavy, suffocating silk around her waist. The dress was a monstrosity of lace and pearls, worth more than the annual income of the tenant farmers shivering outside the gates. To Audrey, it felt less like a wedding gown and more like a shroud. "Tighter," a voice rasped from the corner of the room. Audrey didn't flinch. She knew that voice better than her own prayers. It belonged to her uncle, Lord Robert Vance, the Earl of Blackwood. Technically, he was her guardian. In reality, he was her jailer. "I cannot breathe, Uncle," Audrey said, her voice calm, but laced with the steeliness that had earned her a reputation as difficult among the local aristocracy. "You don't need to breathe, Audrey," Robert said, stepping into the light. He was a gaunt man, his face ravaged by years of gambling debts and sour wine. He held a glass of brandy, his hand trembling slightly, not from age but from desperation. "You merely need to stand upright, say, 'I do,' and sign the registry. Baron Crouch is not paying for your conversation. Baron Reginald Crouch." The name alone made Audrey's stomach turn. The Baron was 55 years old, a man whose 3 previous wives had died under mysterious circumstances involving staircase falls and sudden fevers. He possessed a fortune large enough to clear Robert's gambling debts in a single afternoon. That was the transaction, Audrey's life for Robert's solvency. "I will not marry him," Audrey said, stepping down from the pedestal, ignoring the gasp of the head seamstress, Mrs. Gable. "I told you 3 days ago, and I tell you now. I will scream the moment the priest asks for my consent. I will cause such a scandal that the bishop himself will hear of it." Robert laughed. It was a dry, cracking sound. He motioned for the seamstresses to leave. Mrs. Gable hesitated, looking at Audrey with eyes full of pity before hurrying her assistants out of the room. When the heavy oak door clicked shut, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. "You think you have a choice?" Robert whispered, closing the distance between them. He smelled of old tobacco and decay. "You think because your father, my saint of a brother, left you the estate in that cursed will, that you command me?" "The law commands you," Audrey retorted. "I turn 21 in 2 weeks. The trust transfers to me. You are trying to sell me before the clock runs out." Robert grabbed her wrist, his fingers digging into her skin. "The wedding is tomorrow at noon. Crouch is already downstairs drinking my cellar dry. You are going to marry him, because if you don't, I will have your little maid, Martha, thrown into the streets without a reference. I will burn your father's library. I will dismantle this house, stone by stone, until you have nothing left to inherit." Audrey pulled her arm back, her heart hammering against her ribs. She knew he wasn't bluffing. Robert was a desperate rat in a trap of his own making. "There is someone who will stop you," she said, her voice trembling for the first time. Robert paused, a cruel sneer spreading across his face. "Ah, the Duke. Eric Thorne." He chuckled darkly. "You still believe in fairy tales, Audrey? You think the Duke of Ashbourne cares about a girl he hasn't seen in 3 years? He is in London, bedding opera singers and drinking with the Prince Regent. He has forgotten the smell of your hair." "He promised," Audrey whispered. "Promises," Robert spat, turning back to the door, "are for children and fools. Tomorrow you become a baroness. Tonight you stay in your room. I've doubled the guard at the door." He slammed the door, and the sound of the heavy iron key turning in the lock echoed like a gunshot. Audrey rushed to the window. The sun was setting, casting long, blood-red shadows across the moors. She pressed her hand against the cold glass. Somewhere out there, beyond the hills and the fog, was Ashbourne Hall. "Come to me," she thought, projecting the words with every ounce of her will. "Eric, if you ever loved me, come to me now." But the moors were silent, and the sun was dying. To understand why Audrey Vance held on to hope while trapped in that room, one must look at the historical context of the relationship between the Vances and the Thornes. This was not a simple flirtation. It was a bond forged in tragedy. 3 years prior, in the summer of 1781, Northumberland had been a different place. It was warm, the heather was in full purple bloom, and Eric Thorne was not yet the Duke of Ashbourne. He was merely the second son, wild, reckless, and brilliantly intelligent. Audrey remembered the day they truly met. It wasn't at a ballroom, but near the river bordering their estates. She had been 18, trying to retrieve a hawk that had flown astray. Eric had found her knee-deep in mud, ruining a dress worth 50 guineas. Instead of mocking her, he had waded in, ruined his own boots, and helped her coax the bird down. "You have a terrible handle on your animals, Lady Audrey," he had teased, wiping mud from his cheek. He was devastatingly handsome then, with dark hair that fell into eyes the colour of storm clouds. "And you, Mr. Thorne, have a terrible reputation for being where you shouldn't be," she had countered. That summer became a secret history, recorded only in the margins of Audrey's diaries. They met in the ruined abbey by the creek. They rode horses across the ridges at dawn. Eric was the only one who listened to her ideas about land reform and literature. Audrey was the only one who saw the sadness behind Eric's reckless bravado, the pain of being the spare heir ignored by his father. The turning point came in August 1781, during the Blackwood Harvest Ball. They had slipped away to the stone gazebo in the gardens. The air was thick with the scent of jasmine. Eric had taken her hands, his grip intense, desperate. "I am leaving, Audrey," he had said. "My father has purchased a commission for me in the army. They are sending me to the Americas." "No," she had gasped, feeling the world tilt. "You can't. I have no money of my own. I have no title. I cannot ask for your hand with nothing to offer but a soldier's pay," Eric admitted, the shame burning in his voice. "Your uncle would laugh me out of the room." "I don't care about titles," Audrey had cried. "I do," Eric snapped, then softened, pulling her into an embrace that knocked the breath from her. "I care because you deserve a kingdom, not a tent. But listen to me." He pulled a ring from his pinky finger, a heavy silver signet with the thorn crest. He pressed it into her palm. "Wait for me. 3 years. I will return a man worthy of you. I will make my own fortune." "I will wait," Audrey vowed. if it takes a lifetime." They shared a kiss that tasted of salt and desperation, unaware that eyes were watching them from the shadows of the manor. Robert Vance had seen it all, and Robert Vance never forgot a weakness he could exploit. Months later, tragedy struck. Eric's older brother died in a riding accident, and his father followed shortly after, from a heart stopped by grief. Eric was recalled from the army not as a soldier, but as the new Duke of Ashbourne. He was now one of the most powerful men in England. He wrote to Audrey immediately. "My dearest Audrey, the title is mine, but it means nothing without you to share it. I am coming home." But Audrey never received that letter. Robert had intercepted it. He burned it in the fireplace of the library, along with the 5 letters that followed. To Audrey, he presented a different narrative, forged clippings from London gazettes detailing Eric's debauchery, and a fake letter from Eric breaking off their childish attachment. Heartbroken, believing she had been abandoned, Audrey had retreated into herself. Eric, receiving no reply and hearing rumours planted by Robert that Audrey was happily courting a baron, grew cold and bitter. He stayed in London, building a wall of ice around his heart. Now, in 1784, the deception was about to reach its climax. Back in her room, Audrey paced the floor. She stopped at her vanity and opened a secret drawer. Inside lay the silver signet ring. It was the one thing Robert hadn't found. She held it to the candlelight. It was her only proof that the summer of 1781 had been real. "He thinks you abandoned him," she realized with a sudden, chilling clarity. Robert lied to both of us. She needed to get a message out, not a plea for help, but the truth. There was a soft scratch at the door. "My lady," came a whisper through the keyhole. It was Martha, the maid Robert had threatened. Audrey rushed to the door. "Martha, is he gone?" "The master is in the study with the baron," Martha whispered, her voice trembling. "They are drinking, but, my lady, I heard them talking. They aren't waiting for noon tomorrow." Audrey's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "The baron. He is impatient, and the master is afraid you will run. They are moving the ceremony. The priest is coming at dawn, and—" Martha hesitated, a sob catching in her throat. "The master said you are too much trouble in this room. He said the window is too low to the ground." "Where are they putting me, Martha?" "The tower, my lady, the widow's tower. They are coming for you within the hour." The widow's tower was a derelict spire on the cliff's edge of the estate. It had no glass in the windows, only iron bars. It was a stone coffin. "Martha," Audrey said, her voice dropping to a command, "listen to me carefully. I need you to run." "Run where, my lady?" "To Ashbourne Hall. You must find the Duke." "But the storm, it's miles away, and the guards. Take the servants' path through the creek. Take my mare. She's in the south stable. The groom is loyal to me. You must ride like the devil himself is chasing you." Audrey slid the silver ring under the door gap. "Give him this. Tell him nothing else. Just give him the ring and say, 'The pact of the gazebo is being burned at dawn.'" I will try, my lady. Go, before they come." Footsteps echoed at the end of the hallway. Heavy, boot-clad footsteps. "Run, Martha." As the maid's light footsteps faded away, Audrey stood back. She smoothed her dress. She lifted her chin. The key turned in the lock again. The door flew open. Robert stood there, flanked by 2 burly groundskeepers. "Pack a cloak, niece," Robert sneered. "You're changing your accommodations." Audrey didn't scream. She didn't cry. She looked at the empty space on the floor where the ring had been moments ago, and she smiled, a sharp, dangerous smile. "Lead the way, uncle," she said, "but you better hope your walls are thick." The grounds of Blackwood Manor. October 29th, 1784, 9 p.m. The journey from the manor house to the widow's tower was less than a quarter of a mile, yet it felt to Audrey like a procession to the gallows. The storm that had been threatening the coast all afternoon finally broke. The rain didn't fall. It was driven sideways by a gale that shrieked off the North Sea, stinging the skin like handfuls of gravel. Audrey walked between the two groundskeepers, her silk slippers sinking into the freezing mud with every step. She refused to be dragged. She held her head high, shielding her face from the wind with a fragile pride, even as the water soaked the hem of her heavy gown, making it drag behind her like a lead weight. Robert walked ahead, carrying a lantern that swung violently in the wind, casting erratic, dancing shadows against the wet grass. He looked back only once. "You have brought this upon yourself, Audrey," he shouted over the roar of the wind. "A night in the damp will teach you the value of a warm hearth and a wealthy husband." Audrey did not answer. She saved her breath for shivering. The cold was already seeping through her cloak, finding her bones. They reached the widow's tower. It stood on a jagged promontory of rock, overlooking the churning black ocean. Built 3 centuries prior by a mad ancestor who wanted to watch the stars, it had long since fallen into ruin. The roof remained, but the windows were gaping maws, devoid of glass, barred only by rusted iron grates. The heavy wooden door groaned as the guards forced it open. The smell hit Audrey instantly, a mixture of rotting wet straw, bird droppings, and the metallic tang of the sea. "Inside," Robert commanded. Audrey stepped over the threshold. The room was circular, the stone walls weeping with moisture. There was no furniture, save for a single, broken wooden stool in the center. The wind howled through the barred windows, swirling the dead leaves that had gathered in the corners. It was not just a room, it was a refrigerator. "Uncle," Audrey said, turning to face him as he stood in the doorway. Her voice was quiet, stripped of its earlier defiance, replaced by a chilling calm. "If I die in here tonight, my ghost will haunt you until you tear your own eyes out." Robert's face twitched. For a fleeting second, the superstitious fear of a desperate man flashed in his eyes, but the debt collectors were more real to him than ghosts. "You won't die," he muttered, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. "Baron Crouch likes his brides pale." He stepped back. The door slammed shut. The sound of the lock engaging was heavy and final, a clunk thud that vibrated through the stone floor. Audrey stood in the pitch blackness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, illuminating the churning white caps of the sea far below. She moved to the corner where the wind was least severe and huddled into a ball. The cold was an immediate physical assault. She rubbed her arms, her teeth chattering violently. She thought of the warm library she had left behind. She thought of the fire in the grate. But mostly, she thought of Martha. The Moors. October 29th, 1784, 9:45 p.m. Miles away, Martha was fighting a losing battle against the earth itself. The maid was small, frail, and terrified of horses. The mare Audrey had given her, a roan named Bess, was skittish in the thunder. They were off the main road, navigating the treacherous Servants' Cut, a sheep trail that wound through the thick heather and peat bogs of the moors. The mud was treacherous. Every few yards, Bess's hooves would suck deep into the mire, threatening to throw them both. Martha clung to the reins with frozen fingers, her bonnet long since blown away, her hair plastered to her skull by the relentless rain. "Please," she sobbed into the dark. "Please, Bess, keep going." A fork of lightning split the sky, striking an ancient oak tree on the ridge ahead. The boom was deafening. Bess reared, screaming in panic. Martha, possessing no skill in the saddle, was thrown backward. She hit the ground hard. The breath was knocked out of her lungs, and she rolled down the embankment, splashing into a freezing, shallow ditch. For a moment, she lay there, stunned, staring up at the angry, bruising sky. Her shoulder throbbed with a dull, sickening heat. The horse, spooked, had bolted into the darkness. Martha was alone, 5 miles from Ashbourne Hall. She groaned, pushing herself up with her good arm. Mud coated her face, her mouth, her eyes. She wanted to lie down. She wanted to sleep. The cold was inviting her to close her eyes. He said the window is too low to the ground. Martha remembered the master's words about Lady Audrey. She remembered the kindness Audrey had shown her, teaching her to read when the housekeeper said it was a waste of time, giving her medicine when her mother was sick. Martha reached into her bodice. Her fingers brushed the cold, hard metal of the silver signet ring. It was still there. She forced herself to stand. Her knees shook. She wiped the mud from her eyes. "I'm sorry, my lady," she whispered to the wind. "I cannot ride." She looked toward the distant, dark silhouette of the Ashbourne hills. "But I can walk." Limping, shivering, and fueled by a loyalty that defied all logic, Martha began to trudge through the sludge. Ashbourne Hall, the Duke's study, October 29th, 1784, 11:15 p.m. Ashbourne Hall was a fortress of warmth and light, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. In the west wing, the study of the Duke was a masterpiece of mahogany and velvet. A fire roared in the massive hearth, consuming logs of applewood that scented the air with a sweet, smoky fragrance. But the man sitting in the high-backed leather chair felt none of the warmth. Eric Thorne, the Duke of Ashbourne, stared into the flames with a glass of amber whiskey balanced precariously on the arm of his chair. At 25, he looked older. The war in the Americas had left a jagged scar on his left shoulder, but the years of dissipation in London had left deeper marks on his face. There were shadows under his eyes and a permanent tightness to his jaw. He was undeniably handsome, tall, broad-shouldered, with the dark, brooding features that made débutantes swoon behind their fans. But he was also terrifying. The servants at Ashbourne Hall walked on eggshells around him. He spoke little, smiled never, and possessed a temper that could freeze a room faster than the winter wind. Tonight, he was particularly foul. On the desk before him lay a stack of invitations. Balls, hunts, dinners. The local gentry were desperate to curry favour with the returned Duke. He had thrown them all into the fire, watching the heavy cardstock curl and blacken. One name haunted him. Vance. He had heard the rumours in the village earlier that day. Lady Audrey Vance was to marry Baron Crouch tomorrow. The thought made his hand tighten around the whiskey glass until the crystal threatened to snap. Let her marry him, he told himself, the bitterness rising like bile. Let her marry that old lecher. It is what she deserves. She never answered my letters. She forgot me the moment I left. He took a long swallow of the drink, welcoming the burn. He remembered the girl by the river. He remembered the promise in the gazebo. He remembered the fool he had been to believe that a love forged in mud and moonlight could survive the realities of title and wealth. Robert Vance had told him Audrey had laughed at his proposal letters. Eric believed it because it was easier to hate her than to mourn her. The heavy oak doors of the study creaked open. Eric didn't turn around. "I told you, Higgins, I require nothing. Leave the bottle." "Your Grace," came the hesitant voice of his butler, Higgins. The man sounded distressed, which was unlike him. Higgins was a man who could announce the apocalypse with a stiff upper lip. "I apologize for the intrusion, but there is a situation at the scullery door." "A situation?" Eric drawled, staring at the fire. "If it is a poacher, shoot him. If it is a beggar, feed him and send him away." "It is a woman, your grace. She's in a frightful state, covered in bog mud, half frozen. She collapsed on the threshold." Eric sighed, irritated. "Send for the physician, then. Why are you telling me?" "Because, your grace. She refuses to let the maids tend to her. She is hysterical. She keeps screaming that she must see you. She says she has something from the gazebo." Eric froze. The fire seemed to roar louder in his ears. The word hung in the air, heavy and impossible. Gazebo. No one knew about that place. No one but him and her. He set the glass down slowly. He stood up, his towering frame casting a long shadow across the Persian rug. "Bring her in," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "In here, your grace. She is dripping with filth." "Bring her in!" Eric roared, turning to face the butler with eyes that blazed with sudden, terrifying intensity. Higgins bowed hurriedly and retreated. Moments later, the doors opened again. 2 footmen, half carried, half dragged a small figure into the room. Martha looked less like a human and more like a creature of the swamp. She was trembling so violently that her teeth clicked together audibly. A puddle of dark water formed instantly on the expensive rug. Eric crossed the room in 3 long strides. He waved the footmen away. They released Martha, and she sank to her knees, unable to stand. Eric knelt before her. He didn't care about the mud ruining his velvet breeches. He looked at the terrified maid, searching her face. "Who are you?" he demanded, though his voice was softer now. Martha, your grace," she chattered. "Lady Audrey's maid." "Audrey sent you?" Eric's heart hammered against his ribs. "Why, to invite me to her wedding? To gloat?" "No," Martha wept, her hands fumbling in her wet apron. "No, your grace. You don't know." She pulled out her hand. In her palm, caked with dirt, sat a ring. Eric stopped breathing. He reached out, his fingers trembling slightly, and took it. He wiped the mud away with his thumb. The silver crest of the thorns gleamed in the firelight. The ring he had given her. The ring she was supposed to have thrown away years ago. "She kept it," he whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "She kept it all this time. She never stopped waiting," Martha sobbed. "The letters. Master Robert burned them. He told her you abandoned her. He told her you were laughing at her." Eric closed his eyes. The rage that filled him was so sudden, so absolute, that he felt dizzy. Robert. The lies. The wasted years. The cruelty of it all crumbled the wall he had built around his heart, leaving only raw, exposed nerve. "Where is she?" Eric asked, opening his eyes. They were no longer the eyes of a bored aristocrat. They were the eyes of a soldier. "He moved the wedding," Martha gasped. "Dawn. The priest comes at dawn. He locked her up, to keep her from running." "Locked her in her room?" "No, your grace." Martha looked up, her eyes wide with horror. "The widow's tower, the one on the cliffs, no glass, no fire. She was wearing only silk." Eric looked at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was 11:30 p.m. The temperature outside was dropping below freezing. The widow's tower was a death trap in this weather. He stood up, clutching the ring in his fist so tight it cut into his skin. "Higgins!" he bellowed. The sound echoed through the entire manor. The butler appeared instantly. "Your grace? Wake the stable master. I want Obsidian saddled, now. Your grace, the storm." "And wake the men," Eric cut him off, his voice cold steel. "Not the footmen. My old regiment men, the ones who served with me in Yorktown. Tell them to arm themselves." "Arm themselves, sir?" Higgins paled. "May I ask what the intention is?" Eric walked to the wall where a brace of heavy cavalry pistols hung on display. He took them down, checking the flint and powder with practiced, lethal efficiency. He turned to the butler, his eyes burning with a fire that would consume Blackwood Manor whole. "The intention, Higgins," Eric said, sliding the pistols into his belt, "is an abduction, or a rescue. History can decide which." He looked at the shivering maid on the floor. "Get her warm," he commanded the staff. "Give her anything she wants." Eric strode toward the door, his coat billowing behind him like a cape. He paused at the threshold, looking out into the dark, swirling corridor. "If Robert Vance has let a single hair on her head freeze," he whispered to the empty air, "I will burn his world to ash." He stepped out into the night. The Midnight Duke had awoken. The Road to Blackwood, October 29th, 1784, 11:40 p.m. History records many great cavalry charges, but few were as reckless or as personal as the ride of the Ashbourne men that night. Eric Thorne rode at the head of a phalanx of 6 men. These were not mere grooms or footmen. They were veterans of the colonial campaigns, men who had stood beside him in the trenches of Yorktown, men who knew the sound of a bullet snapping past their ears. They rode not for the Duke, but for the man, Eric, who had once carried their wounded sergeant a mile through a swamp. The storm had turned the world into a chaotic void. The rain was horizontal, a curtain of ice that stung the eyes and numbed the hands. The lanterns carried by the men were useless, their flames snuffed out within seconds of leaving the stable yard. They rode by the intermittent, strobe light flashes of lightning. Eric was bent low over the neck of Obsidian, a massive black stallion whose hooves tore up the sodden earth. Eric felt no cold. He felt only a white-hot burning in his chest, a mixture of adrenaline and a terror he had never admitted to feeling on a battlefield. I am too late. The thought looped in his mind, keeping time with the thundering hooves. I wasted 3 years in pride, and now she dies in the dark. "Your Grace!" shouted Captain Halloway, pulling his horse alongside Eric's. Halloway was a burly man, his voice barely audible over the gale. "The bridge at Willow's Creek! It's gone! The water has taken it!" Eric pulled Obsidian to a sliding halt, mud spraying in an arc. He looked ahead. Through the driving rain, he saw the dark, swirling torrent where the stone bridge had stood for a century. The creek had swollen into a raging river, tearing trees from the banks. "We have to go around," Halloway yelled, shielding his eyes. "The ford is 3 miles upstream." 3 miles is an hour in this mud," Eric roared back. "She doesn't have an hour." He looked at the water. It was black, churning, and deadly. Debris, logs, fence posts, shot past in the current like battering rams. To enter that water was madness. Eric turned his horse to face the torrent. "Your Grace, no!" Halloway screamed, realizing his intent. "It's suicide!" "Then go back!" Eric shouted. "Go back to the fire and drink to my health!" He dug his spurs into Obsidian's flanks. The horse hesitated, sensing the danger, but Eric's will was absolute. With a powerful lunge, the stallion leaped from the bank into the boiling black water. The cold hit Eric like a physical hammer. The current grabbed them instantly, dragging them downstream. Obsidian kicked wildly, his head fighting to stay above the foam. Eric slipped his boots from the stirrups. If the horse went down, he wouldn't be dragged to the bottom, but he kept his grip on the mane. "Swim!" Eric gritted his teeth, water filling his mouth. "Swim, you beast!" For an eternity, perhaps a minute, perhaps 10, they were spun in the dark, debris crashing against the horse's flank. Eric felt a heavy log slam into his leg, a sickening crunch that surely meant a bruise, if not a fracture. He ignored it. Suddenly, Obsidian's hooves found purchase on the slate of the opposite bank. With a heave that strained every muscle in the animal's massive body, they scrambled up the mud, sliding, slipping, until they crested the ridge. Eric gasped for air, patting the shivering neck of the horse. He turned back. One by one, 6 other horses plunged into the water. They were madmen. They were loyalists. They followed him into the void. The Widow's Tower, October 29th, 1784, 11:50 p.m. Audrey had stopped shivering. She knew, from the medical texts she had read in her father's library, that this was a bad sign. Shivering was the body's fight. When the shivering stopped, the body was surrendering. She sat in the corner of the stone room, her knees pulled to her chest. Her wedding dress, the magnificent prison of silk and pearls, was stiff with ice. It felt like armor. The darkness was absolute, but her mind was beginning to paint pictures. She saw the fireplace in the drawing room. She saw her mother, who had died when she was 6, beckoning to her from a warm, sunlit garden. "It's warm here, Audrey," the phantom whispered. "Just close your eyes." "No," Audrey mumbled, her lips blue and cracked. "No, I have to. Stay awake." She tried to move her fingers, but they felt like wooden dowels, disconnected from her body. The wind howled through the glassless windows, a banshee scream that sounded like her name. Audrey. Audrey. She thought of Eric, not the bitter man the rumors described, but the boy who had waded into the mud for her hawk. She wondered if he was warm. She hoped he was. She hoped he wouldn't blame himself when they found her in the morning. "I kept the ring," she thought, her mind drifting like a leaf on a stream. "I hope he knows I kept it." Her head grew heavy. The stone wall behind her felt surprisingly soft, like a velvet cushion. The pain in her limbs was fading, replaced by a strange, heavy comfort. The sweet sleep of the freezing was settling in. "Just for a moment," she whispered to the empty, howling room. "I'll rest my eyes. Just for a moment." Her chin dropped to her chest. Her breathing shallowed to a faint wisp of mist in the freezing air. Outside, the grandfather clock in the distant village of Blackwood began to toll. Bong, bong. It was midnight, the witching hour, the time when magic ends and reality crashes down. Blackwood Manor, the Great Hall. October 30th, 1784, 12:05. Inside the manor, the storm was merely a backdrop to the celebration. Robert Vance and Baron Crouch sat in the high-ceilinged library, a room lined with the books Robert had never read. The fire was roaring, casting a warm, orange glow over the crystal decanters and the silver trays of roasted pheasant. Baron Crouch was a corpulent man with a face flushed red from wine and heat. He laughed, a wet, gurgling sound, as he refilled his glass. "To a swift ceremony," Crouch toasted, raising his goblet, "and to a compliant bride. You assure me she will be tractable." "By morning?" Robert swirled his brandy, staring into the amber liquid. "A night in the tower breaks the spirit, Reginald. It strips away the pride. She will be so grateful for a blanket and a fire that she will sign whatever we put in front of her. She will kiss your hand for a cup of tea." "Good," Crouch grunted. "I don't like spirit in a woman. It's tiresome." "The debt," Robert reminded him gently. "The papers are prepared?" Yes. Crouch waved a dismissive hand. "My solicitor brings them at dawn with the priest. Your debts are cleared the moment the ring is on her finger." Robert smiled. It was a smile of relief, but it didn't reach his eyes. He took a sip. "Then we have nothing to worry about." Crash. The sound came from the front of the house. It was not the thunder. It was the distinct, shattering sound of heavy oak splintering under immense force. Robert froze. "What was that?" Before the Baron could answer, there was a commotion in the hallway, shouting, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the floor. The library doors, double doors of solid mahogany, exploded inward. They didn't just open, they were kicked open with such violence that one of the hinges sheared off, sending the door hanging crookedly. Standing in the frame was a nightmare. Eric Thorne was drenched from head to toe, his clothes plastered to his body, water pooling rapidly at his feet. His hair was wild, matted with rain. His face was a mask of pale fury, his eyes dark hollows that burned with a terrifying light. In each hand he held a heavy cavalry pistol. Behind him stood his 6 men, sabres drawn, looking less like soldiers and more like executioners. "Lord Ashbourne?" Robert stood up, his glass slipping from his fingers and shattering on the floor. "What is the meaning of this? You are trespassing." Eric didn't speak. He walked into the room. The water squelched in his boots. He raised the pistol in his right hand and leveled it at Baron Crouch. Crouch squealed, dropping behind the sofa. "He's mad! Robert, call the guards!" "Your guards are unconscious," Eric said. His voice was terrifyingly calm, a low rumble that vibrated in the chest. "And if you speak again, Baron, I will paint this library with your brains." He turned the gun toward Robert. "Where is she?" Robert swallowed hard. He tried to summon his arrogance, the haughtiness of the Earl, but it withered under Eric's gaze. "I don't know what you mean. Audrey is resting." Bang! Eric fired. The bullet smashed into the mantelpiece, inches from Robert's ear, showering him in marble dust. Robert screamed, falling back into his chair. "The next one goes in your knee," Eric said, cocking the second pistol. "Where is she?" "The tower!" Robert shrieked, his composure gone. "The widow's tower. Take her! Just take her!" Eric didn't waste a word. He turned to Captain Halloway. "Secure them," Eric ordered. "If they move, bleed them." "With pleasure, Your Grace," Halloway growled, stepping forward with his sabre. Eric spun around and ran. He ran back out into the storm, not toward the stables, but on foot, sprinting toward the cliffs. The Widow's Tower, 12 after dawn 15. The door to the tower was locked. Eric didn't have a key. He didn't wait for the lockpick. He didn't look for a rock. He slammed his shoulder into the wood, again and again. The pain in his bruised shoulder flared, blinding white, but he used it. He focused the pain into force. 1, 2, 3. The rotten wood around the lock gave way. The door swung open, banging against the stone wall. "Audrey!" He rushed into the darkness. The wind inside was deafening. He fumbled for the flint in his pocket, striking a spark to light the small lantern he had grabbed from the hall. The weak yellow light flared to life. He swung the light around. "Audrey!" He saw her in the corner. She was a pile of wet silk and shadow. She wasn't moving. Eric dropped the lantern and fell to his knees beside her. He pulled her into his arms. She was ice. Not cold. Ice. Her skin was the color of marble, her lips a terrifying shade of violet. "No, no, no!" Eric pleaded, his voice cracking. He ripped off his heavy, sodden coat, realizing it was wet and useless, and instead pulled her tight against his chest, trying to transfer his own body heat to her. "Audrey, wake up! Look at me! It's Eric!" She was limp. Her head lolled back against his arm. He placed 2 fingers against her neck. For a second, he felt nothing. The world stopped. The storm went silent. His heart shattered. Then, a flutter. Faint, erratic. A bird's wing trapped under snow. She was alive. Barely. "I have you," he sobbed, burying his face in her freezing wet hair. "I have you, and I am never letting you go." He scooped her up. The dress was heavy with water, but she felt weightless to him. He stood up, cradling her like a child. "Stay with me," he commanded her, moving toward the door. "You waited 3 years, Audrey. Do not dare leave me now." He stepped out of the tower, shielding her face from the wind with his body. He looked toward the manor, where the lights glowed warm and yellow. He began to run. He ran with the desperation of a man carrying his own soul in his hands. Back in the library, Robert Vance watched his guards being tied up by the Ashbourne men. He looked at the shattered marble of his fireplace. He realized, with a sinking dread, that the debt collectors were the least of his worries. The Duke had returned, and he had brought the storm inside with him. Blackwood Manor, the library, October 30th, or 1784, 1°C. The library, once a cold room of calculated business, had been transformed into a sanctuary. The heavy oak doors were barricaded. Captain Halloway stood guard outside, his sabre drawn, ensuring that neither Robert nor the Baron could flee the house. Inside, the fire had been stoked to a roaring blaze that licked the chimney bricks. Eric had swept the papers and decanters off the large leather sofa. There, wrapped in 3 layers of wool blankets taken from the servants' quarters and a heavy fur throw from the floor, lay Audrey. The magnificent wedding dress, the instrument of her torture, lay in a sodden, ruined heap in the corner. Eric had cut the laces with a knife, freeing her lungs, desperate to get the freezing wet silk off her skin. He sat on the floor beside her, his own wet shirt discarded, his skin radiating heat. He held her hands between his, rubbing them rhythmically, relentlessly. "Come back," he whispered, pressing her cold fingers against his cheek. "The fire is here. I am here." Audrey's breathing was no longer a wisp. It was deeper, ragged but steady. The sweet sleep of hypothermia was receding, replaced by the painful prickling of blood returning to frozen limbs. She groaned, a sound of pure misery. "I know," Eric soothed, brushing a damp lock of hair from her forehead. "It hurts. That means you're alive. Let it hurt." Her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, painfully, they opened. Her eyes, usually a bright, sharp hazel, were cloudy and confused. They darted around the room, focusing on the fire, then the ceiling, and finally on the face of the man hovering over her. She stared at him for a long time, as if trying to conjure a ghost. "Eric?" she rasped. Her voice was like broken glass. "I'm here. Am I dead?" "No," Eric said, a sad smile touching his lips. "Though I intend to kill the man who put you in that tower." Audrey let out a shuddering breath. She pulled her hand from the blankets and reached out, touching the scar on his shoulder. It was warm. Real. "You came," she whispered, tears spilling from her eyes. "You were in America. You were gone." "I was never gone," Eric said fiercely. He reached into his breeches pocket and pulled out the muddy silver signet ring. "And neither were you." He took her hand. It was still cold, red raw from the wind. He slid the heavy ring back onto her pinky finger. It was loose. Her hands were so thin, but he closed her fist around it. "I am sorry I was late," he said, his voice breaking. "I will spend the rest of my life making up for the hours you spent in the dark." Audrey closed her eyes, gripping the ring. "Don't let them take me." "Look at me," Eric commanded softly. She opened her eyes. "You are Audrey Vance," he said. "And by noon tomorrow, you will be the Duchess of Ashbourne. There is no man in England who can take you from me now. Not the Baron, not your uncle, not the King himself." The drawing room, October 30th, 1784, 2:30 a.m. While Audrey slept the sleep of exhaustion, warmed by the fire and watched over by Martha, who had been carried in by the cook, cleaned and fed, Eric went to deal with the monsters. Robert Vance and Baron Crouch were being held in the drawing room. They were not bound, but they were terrified. 4 of Eric's veterans stood in the corners of the room, silent and menacing. When Eric entered, he had changed into dry clothes, a simple white shirt and breeches borrowed from the Blackwood wardrobe. He looked less like a wild beast now and more like a judge. He walked to the small writing desk and picked up a sheaf of papers. "Lord Ashbourne," Robert began, his voice trembling. This is a misunderstanding. Familial discipline is hardly a matter for—" "Sit down," Eric said. He didn't shout. He didn't have to. Robert sat. "I have been reading your ledgers," Eric said, tapping the papers. "You are destitute, Robert. You owe the banks in London £4,000. You owe the local merchants £2,000. And you owe Baron Crouch." He looked at the sweating Baron. "How much?" "5,000 guineas, Crouch squeaked. "But, under the circumstances, I am willing to forgive the debt if—" "There are no ifs," Eric cut him off. "And there is no debt." Eric reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a heavy thud that spoke of gold. "I am buying the debt," Eric stated. Robert's eyes went wide. "What?" "I am purchasing the notes," Eric explained, cold legal precision. "As of this moment, Robert, you do not owe the Baron. You owe me." The colour drained from Robert's face. To owe the Baron was to risk a lawsuit. To owe the Duke of Ashbourne, a man he had tried to destroy, was a death sentence. "I will foreclose on Blackwood Manor at dawn," Eric continued. "The estate will be seized to pay the debt. The house, the lands, the title deeds, they will be held in trust for your niece until she comes of age in 2 weeks. You can't leave me with nothing," Robert whispered. "I am leaving you with your life," Eric said, leaning in close. "Which is more than you deserve. You have 1 hour to pack a trunk. A carriage is waiting to take you to the coast. There is a packet ship leaving for France tomorrow. I suggest you be on it. And if I refuse? Then my men will escort you to the magistrate," Eric said. "And I will have you charged with attempted murder. The Widow's Tower is not a prison, Robert. It is a tomb. Attempting to freeze an heiress to death. The hanging judges in London will enjoy that case." Robert looked at Eric. Then he looked at the veterans with their sabres. He stood up, his legs shaking, and walked out of the room without a word. Eric turned to Baron Crouch. The Baron was already backing toward the door. I was merely a guest, Your Grace. I knew nothing of the tower. I will be leaving." "Baron!" Eric called out. Crouch froze. "If I ever see your carriage in Northumberland again," Eric said, "I will assume you have come to challenge me to a duel. And I never miss." The Baron fled into the night. The chapel, October 30th, year 1784, noon. The storm had passed. The sun broke over the horizon, glittering on the wet grass and the white caps of the sea. The priest, who had been summoned by Robert to perform a forced marriage, instead found himself officiating a very different union. There were no guests. There was no choir. The pews were empty, save for 6 rough-looking soldiers, and a maid named Martha, who sat in the front row, weeping with joy. Audrey walked down the aisle. She did not wear the silk monstrosity. She wore a simple blue velvet dress found in her mother's old trunk. She was pale, and she leaned heavily on Eric's arm, but her head was high. They stood before the altar. "Do you, Eric, take this woman?" Eric looked down at her. He saw the shadows under her eyes, the bruises on her wrists, but he also saw the fire that had kept her alive in the tower. "I do," he said, "for every hour of every day." "And do you, Audrey?" Audrey tightened her grip on his hand. She looked at the silver ring on her finger. "I do," she whispered. "I did 3 years ago, and I do now." As they kissed, the bells of the chapel began to ring, not the mournful toll of the midnight bell, but a joyous, clamouring peal that echoed across the moors, telling the tenant farmers, the villagers, and the world that the winter of Blackwood Manor was over. The midnight Duke had arrived, and he had brought the spring. The marriage of Eric and Audrey Thorne became a legend in Northumberland. Historical records show that under their care, the Ashbourne and Blackwood estates flourished. They built the first school for tenant children in the county and were vocal advocates for prison reform in the House of Lords. Robert Vance died penniless in a Parisian flophouse 5 years later. Baron Crouch never returned to the north. As for the widow's tower, the Duke did not tear it down. Instead, he had the iron bars removed and glass windows installed. He turned the cold stone room into a lighthouse, keeping a lamp burning every night, a symbol that no one in his domain would ever again be left in the dark. The story of Audrey Vance is a reminder that the strongest prisons are not made of stone, but of fear, and the only key that can truly unlock them is not a piece of iron, but the unshakable promise of someone who refuses to give up on you. Did this story send a chill down your spine? It's terrifying to think how close Audrey came to being just another forgotten name in a family tree. If you were in Eric's shoes, staring at that freezing black river, would you have jumped in? Or would you have turned back? Let me know in the comments below. I read every single one. If you enjoyed this journey into the dark, romantic corners of history, please hit that like button. It helps us find more lost stories to tell. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you don't miss our next episode, where we'll uncover the scandal of the Victorian poison ring. Until next time, keep the lantern burning.